pêche des cœurs, je ne veux plus aller. Je ne veux plus ma mère. Y en a trop de douleur quand l'amour s'envolait. Et de ces pauvres gars qui pleurent. Ma cocotte, elle est partie avec un vilain bonhomme.
Welcome to the 3% podcast brought to you by Open Letter and 3% and the University of Rochester. This episode, much like the last one, which was in honor of John Barth, who had two books coming out from Dalkey Archive basically at the same time, this episode is going to feature two books by Raymond Queneau, Pierrot Mon Ami, which is being reprinted as a Dalkey Essential and is a classic Queneau work, and then Sally Mara's Intimate Journal, which is being published in English for the first time ever. And much like the last episode, I have two special guests to help talk about Queneau, two experts in the field. First off, we have Chris Clarke, who is a translator and professor. He also is the co-editor of the online journal Hopscotch Translation, editor of the Yukon-based World Poetry Review, and co-edited the literary anthology Praxis. Some of his translations include Raymond Queneau's The Skin of Dreams, which is going to be coming out later this year from NYRB, Julio Cortázar and Julio Silvia's What the Mugwig has to say, and Landia, which I know I was butchering that, a book by Eric Xavier, Marcel Schwab's Imaginary Lives, Patrick Modiano's In the Cafe of Lost Youth, a number of things. So thanks, first of all, Chris, for joining. And then our other guest is Daniel Levin Becker, whose Wikipedia page is an amazing potpourri of true and false information. He is also a translator and author. You might remember him from a much earlier episode back from 2012 when we talked about many subtle channels and praise of potential literature, the book that he wrote about the Oulipo, of which he is a member, the second ever American member and the youngest member ever, correct?
Debatable, but roughly, yeah.
Roughly. And you're the former reviews editor for The Believer. That's not current, is it?
That is not current.
Is not current. But you also have translated some works, including Georges Perrec's Dream Journal, Hervé Letelier's short story, Marcel Benabou, and most recently that I'm aware of, The Birthday Party by name I'm not going to pronounce right, so I'm just going to let it go.
Yeah, that guy. Mauvignier. Laurent Mauvignier.
Mauvignier. That's the part that I was scared of, which I actually finished reading like 2 days ago. Finally, I took the time. I really enjoyed it, and the translation is really interesting. So very cool book. Also, according to your Wikipedia page, and this is where it gets kind of fun, you are known for the DLB, a vegetarian BLT in which the traditional bacon and tomato are replaced by tomato, caramelized onion, vegan mayonnaise, and a hint of Haldane mushroom.
Yeah, that sandwich has gotten me into a lot of trouble over the years.
Really?
I don't think it's right for me to edit my own Wikipedia page. So I just let these half truths and total fabrications fester.
Well, I'm gonna make you make us sandwiches though now. I didn't even know this was an option.
Well, it's not, because there's no such thing as a Halton mushroom, but you
just need a hint of it, though. A hint of it.
It's France, so no one knows what half of those mushrooms are.
Exactly.
The trumpets of death.
We could also talk about your band, the Mujeres Encinta, which has a very lively set of YouTube videos, which are quite fun and quite entertaining. But we'll leave that one as a.
Well, let's not.
As a side note, I'll put it in the show notes, and anyone who wants to go down that rabbit hole can go enjoy themselves whenever they want to.
Fair enough.
So, Daniel, let's start with you because you wrote the introduction to Pierrot Mon Ami, and I was wondering if you wanted to sort of set up the nature of Pierrot Mon Ami and also like how you got to know Queneau's work and your sort of role in helping shepherd some of these Oulipian writers into English.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second part because Queneau was the co-founder with François Le Lyonnais of the Oulipo, of which, as Chad said, I became the second American member in 2009. And so discovering the Oulipo came really early in my sort of survey inquiry into French literature. So Queneau was a big figure for me early on, and got to know his stuff along with the rest of the Oulipians, chiefly Georges Perec and Jacques Roubaud, Hervé Letellier, but bunch of dudes who do various cool stuff. The occasional lady who does cool stuff. And Queneau was a really fascinating figure, as I'm sure we'll get into from a bunch of different angles. He was a publisher and a poet and a novelist and translator sometimes, and just had sort of these unending suites of extracurricular interests, including mathematics and cinema and like what I guess you would call the biochemical origins of the universe. Like there's just sort of any topic you could name, Queneau probably had some very on point, very specific sense of expertise about it. And so Pierrot Mon Ami, which is kind of what 48 when he wrote it, when he
came out? 42.
Yeah, it's as I say in the introduction, it was originally conceived as a detective novel. And as you find out when you start to read it, it is sort of a detective like a deconstructed detective novel, the way that a deconstructed samosa might be, like some potato here and some peas here and some spices here, but not wrapped up in the shape that you would expect it to be in.
For all Rochesterians, you're describing a samosa garbage plate.
This is the second time I've heard of garbage plates today. I'm gonna need to know more about what those are.
You don't want to, trust me.
So I can get somebody to add it to my Wikipedia page.
I will put it up there right now.
Yeah. But it's a really fascinating book. Like I think it's just sort of, it's filled with these typical Queneau characters who are super magnetic and strange and articulate and also inarticulate, and they just have these like preoccupations that guide them through their paces around the space that is the novel. And sometimes they overlap, sometimes they kind of miss their connections, sometimes kind of a lot, I think, throughout Queneau's fiction, they just sort of like talk over each other.
Yeah.
Like they have these dialogues that don't like respond to each other in a conventional way, and somehow that makes them feel all the more real.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot of his typical play with what he called the néo-français, like French, not as it was approved of, not as it was sort of like formally sanctioned by the Académie Française, but as it was spoken by real people with their corruptions and their truncations and their like slang and just different kinds of misspeaking. So I feel like it's sort of misses the point to try to summarize what Pierrot Mon Ami is about. Like it's a bunch of characters, mostly in a pretty restrained geographic area, although there are exceptions. And they all just sort of like going about doing their things and pursuing their objectives more or less half-heartedly. And it's just a wonderful, strange romp of a book.
Yeah, and like set in like a carnival or whatever you'd want to call it, that kind of amusement park, which also has and maybe as a weird segue, also like has some slightly pervy aspects to it, which are which are kind of common throughout a lot of Queneau stuff, but it's not like it's necessarily celebrated. But by contrast, like Sally Mara's intimate journal is very pervy as well, and a little bit more aggressively so, to be honest. But yeah, so I agree with you on all the Pierrot Mon Ami stuff. I think it is fun because it does read like the Oulipian writers, all sort of a lot of French writers have that kind of near obsession with like the detective novel and that form, even though it's never quite done in the way that you would expect, or the way that it's been sort of structured and is supposed to quote unquote happen. Like going back to like Boutour's Passing Time is one that I'm always fascinated by, that that's the right one, I believe, that is all about writing about a detective novel that's set in the same town. But anyways, Chris, you wrote your dissertation on Queneau, correct?
500 pages. Yeah.
What,
8 years. 8 years.
It's a lot.
I did.
Tell us about it. Which books? How did you come to write your dissertation on Queneau, and which books of his were particular influences for you?
Well, I focused on Queneau as a translator, and on how translational practices fueled his fiction as well. But it got me thinking. There's a chapter, part of a chapter I wrote about this period, so the 40s into early 1950s, where Queneau is back from his stint in the barracks, and he's chumming around with Boris Vian a lot, and they're both really into crime fiction at this point, early 40s, and it's really the years that crime fiction hits France. You've got Maurice Duhamel, who founds the Série Noire later in the decade, but he started translating, I think, first Raoul Whitfield's Green Ice as early as like 1928 or 1930. And so Queneau and Boris Vian both play with crime fiction in the early to mid 40s, and then they kind of turn towards science fiction closer to 1950. But with Queneau, he can never do it the way you would expect. Boris Vian, I mean, nothing about Boris Vian is really what you'd expect either, but his science fiction is more or less evidently science fiction, and his crime elements are more classical. So here we've got Queneau in 42 writing a detective novel that, as Daniel very nicely explains, is not a detective novel at all. And then by 1950, he's writing science poetry, which is his take on science fiction, which has nothing to do with the genre that we know, but more just how can we integrate the sciences and their language into something as classical as poetry. So yeah, I don't know. I started out from a completely different place, as we often do with dissertations. My initial goal was somewhat insane, and my director told me so. And eventually onto a second director, and a number of years later, it took the form that it did, where I went through all of the books that he translated in the 30s, the 40s into 1950, and then looked at translation strategies and how he used them to translate things like the sciences into his texts, not just from one language to another, but from one discipline to another, one line of thinking to another. But Daniel, I have to say I really enjoyed your introduction, which I read this morning. It gave me an opportunity to go back and actually read some of Barbara Wright's translation of Pierrot as well, which, to be honest, I'd never read before. I read the book in French years ago, but it's not one that I had focused on. And it is a retranslation. We need to point that out as well. And one of several that have come up in the last years. So I think we could just comment briefly on that. The early translations of Queneau came out the late 40s and into the early 50s. And the problem really is that no one knew what it was that he was doing. Yeah. We have the advantage of looking back and having read all of this criticism over the years and seeing what he did later, seeing what the Oulipo did later. But at the time, so the first two, one in the UK and one in the United States in 1948, were Rue du Ver by Betty Asquith and The Skin of Dreams, which I just retranslated, should be out in January, translated by a fellow called Kaplan. And then 2 years later, this first translation of Pierrot by a fellow called McLaren Ross, published in the UK. And it's not the worst of the three, but again, when you don't know what Queneau is playing at, it's really hard to mobilize the understanding of how to replicate some of these linguistic games or these layers that he's building in these books. So to have Barbara Wright come back in the 1980s and redo this was I think, a really important move for her. She'd been translating him at this point since the early 50s. first for Gabor Bocas Press, which was the Temersons. She was one of the founding directors of that press. And she did first Ubu Roi and then some Queneau shorts and then eventually Exercises in Style for them.
Which, speaking of Exercises in Style, when that new version of that came out, you both contributed to that, correct?
Just Chris.
Oh, just Chris. Okay. I thought you had as well.
I contributed enthusiasm.
Okay, fair enough.
We launched them together, though. Daniel had just translated Perrec's Dream
the...
Journals, and that's when we met, is at the launch for those.
Okay, I think that's what I'm thinking of. Do you want to talk about that process for a second, Chris, and explain maybe a little bit because it's interesting with Queneau and with the Oulipo overall, in which there's kind of the two different, not really different, but like in a way, like from as an outsider looking in on this, there's almost two different types of books that can exist. There's the ones that have like the hidden kind of constraints and reasons that build into a story that you may not always be aware of, and sometimes the books fall into that, and sometimes they're not that explicit. And then there's the ones that are very generative, like Exercises in Style or the 100 million billion poems. I got that right?
100,000 billion.
100,000 billion poems. Which I suppose is different in the UK since they do all their fucking numbers different. But but like with those ones, there's like that kind of explosive nature in Exercises in Styles and the 100,000 billion poems, and then the more constrained versions, which I know the first novel, Bark Tree, supposedly has like the mathematical underpinnings. And even though with Pierrot, I don't know if there's anything specific, like any specific restraints, but it has that vibe, like what you're saying, Daniel, when you're describing it, of people kind of overlapping over each other and running in parallel at times, as if there's some secret like mechanism that's making all these people move in certain patterns or have certain things happen. And as a reader, you may not really know what that is, and it's kind of irrelevant, but you can sort of sense that there's some inner workings here. But anyways, going back, Exercises in Style. Do you want to explain it, Chris, and talk about that newer version?
Yeah, well, when I was researching this, actually it was before the dissertation, to be honest. It was during my master's. I was writing a paper on Barbara Wright's translations of the exercises, specifically on the handful of them that she thought were impossible to translate and resorted to substitution, and why that was. And that was my first winter in New York. I was by myself. I didn't know anyone. And while I was at it, I discovered that there were all of these, this handful of others that hadn't been translated because Queneau had, after the founding of the Oulipo, had released a different edition of the exercises in France, where they had subbed out a certain number of exercises and added some back in. And then he had written other ones or incomplete ones that were found in his papers as well. And yeah, that's largely because the English version, the Barbara Wright version, was translated before he had made those changes. So anyway, I found that there were what amounts to 50 pages in that New Directions book of new exercises, a few of which were incomplete, but there were some really good ones too. And so I translated them that winter just as I was working on that paper, just on spec. And it turned out that the following year, New Directions was putting out this anniversary edition, and they gobbled them up as well.
Right. This is really great. I mean, it is, for anyone who doesn't know, specifically Exercises in Style is like one little tiny story of, correct me if I got this wrong, but two people on a bus. One says your button is missing. Essentially, that's it.
Yeah, there are two scenes. They're jostling on the bus, and the fellow has is skinny at the ribbon around his neck or his hat or whatever it is, and then he sees the same guy later in the square telling a friend that there's a button missing off of his jacket. It's not a very entertaining story, but it's told,
which is kind of the point.
Yeah, right. Told in very many in as many entertaining and unentertaining styles as possible.
Right. So like over and over in different versions, be it like on the telephone with half of the call not being there, to like in different rhyming schemes and different like constructions, all different things. Did either of you, I assume you did, Daniel, did you ever have a chance to meet Barbara Wright?
No, never.
No. Okay. I ironically I did. When I was working for Dalkey, we went to London and had dinner with her a couple times, maybe 3 times even, at her house. And she talked a bit about Exercises in Style and how like what you're saying, like what she just replaced ones where she's like, well, he didn't even know I was doing it. Like she just did it because she wanted to, and started to prove that, that it was possible to translate these things, which she didn't think most of them would work. And then she talked about how some of them she just like rewrote and just created her own version because she couldn't quite figure that out. It didn't quite map onto English. But she was a really interesting and lively person with some of the best stories about John Calder that I've ever heard, which is like a sub note to the sort of like Queneau moment, which for anyone who doesn't know, John Calder ran a series of publishing companies in the UK, most of them having Calder in the name. Calder and Boyers, there was one that sort of like split apart, but a lot of Calder published a ton of like experimental and interesting writers from around the world, especially French, including a number of Queneau books. And he was also, and Beckett, and he was also like a notorious sort of con man who was always broke and never paid anyone and figured out ways to like sort of sneak through the system off and on. And Barbara would talk about how like basically she never got paid for any of those translations because he was always like running one scheme or another to like just make it by. Never had anything.
Sounds like the English version of Giraudias at Olympia.
Yeah, very much so. There was I remember looking into his books. This isn't he's passed. Everyone's passed. That's part of this story. So I feel like it's okay to tell. But like I was looking into his Dalkey was looking into acquiring Calder and was looking into his accounting books, and it became clear that anytime that he had 3 different registered entities, and when one of them was about to get sued, he transferred all the assets to a different one, and then would be like, well, you can sue me, but here's my books. There's nothing, and there's no money, so you can't get anything. And then he transfer it to another and just keep like shell gaming everything around to be able to like keep all the books, keep all the rights, keep everything going.
I never had an opportunity to meet her, but I did spend a week going through her papers, which are at Breon Mitchell brought them into the archive in Bloomington, Indiana. The one anecdote about the exorcist that's funny from her point of view is that she misunderstood what the point of one of them was, and Queneau noticed this and just didn't tell her because he thought that it was an interesting generative experiment to see what she would come up with, and that was kind of his point, was there are an infinite different number of ways that you could do this. In fact, in the archive in Belgium, I came across his next series of exercises in style 2, which was not this story, but an attempt at advertising, like radio style advertisements. They're very humorous as well. He only did a half dozen of them or so. One day I'll have to do them up for a journal, but just the idea that he also published a list of, I don't know, another 100 or so possible styles that he didn't bother to write. So this idea of it being a generative thing is absolutely true.
Yeah. I was wondering, because I sort of like introduced the Oulipo there and gave like a brief overview, but Daniel, as a member, do you want to give anyone in the audience that isn't already familiar, which there's probably a handful?
I have nothing to say to those people.
Nothing to say to those people?
No, I'm kidding. Just like a quick overview?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's again, Queneau co-founded it in 1960 with a handful of people. Initially, for the first year or so, the group was sort of like still thought of itself as a seminar about the history of experimental literature. Mm-hmm. And then over time, sort of the weight, the equilibrium of what people were interested in kind of bowed toward the generative side of experimental literature, and using essentially what I say most often nowadays when I describe it is it's sort of a research group dedicated to exploring the generative possibilities of mathematical and scientific models toward the creation of literature. So in practice, that means a lot of constrained writing, like Perrec's detective novel without the letter E, or Calvino's later novels that are, sort of architected according to these very sophisticated algorithms that govern how the plot moves. But then you also have things like what Queneau did. Exercises in Style was, when did that come out?
Good question, because it's listed in a weird place.
Just putting Chris through his paces here.
Yeah, the translation was 58. The book itself was
47.
47.
47, damn, okay. So yeah, like he did a lot of things before the Oulipo existed that, Chris, to your point about hindsight, about the advantage of being able to sort of take Queneau as a finished author. We can do a lot of pattern recognition that I think people probably couldn't have at the time, but there are these things that are not quite so much the application of a constraint or organizing principle to a text, but trying to use a text as a way of demonstrating something about the potentiality of language. And so the 100,000 billion poems, which is a great example and arguably the first Oulipian work that, Queneau was kind of struggling with it around the time that Lullianet and some other friends were like, well, why don't we get together and talk about experimental literature? It's a collection of 10 sonnets with identical rhymes and for the most part identical syntax. And it's printed on 10 pages with a little slit cut between each line of the sonnet so that you could recombine, you could pick for each of the 14 lines of the sonnet, you could pick whether you wanted to come from the first poem, second poem, third poem, etc. So you can have, your own sonnet where line 1 comes from sonnet 7, line 2 comes from sonnet 2, etc. And that engenders 10 to the 14th possible different sonnets, which is this, Queneau calculates that it would take a human being something like 145 million years to read the whole thing.
I couldn't remember what that number was.
Of course, he did the math. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's sort of like what's special about Queneau, I think, is that he managed to be gestural in these sort of thought experiments made into books, but also he backed them up. Like there was material behind them. It wasn't sort of an empty thought experiment between two, bound between covers. It was actually like there was thought and thoughtfulness and care and like a real will to kind of explore.
That was one of the key points that I took from your introduction this morning. You mentioned this idea of there being no identifiable logic in the way the book is put together. But I mean, from the beginning, Queneau put things together very carefully. And so I spent a lot of time working on Le Chien d'An, which was translated as the bark tree and as
Witchgrass.
Witchgrass is the current edition. And yeah, for that, he mapped everything out. So it's not just it's like the order of appearance of characters, but then how they interact. And these two will meet together in this chapter, in this part of the chapter, and these two will then encounter in this chapter. And it's all there. It's all mapped out. And so when you're writing about this key notion of his with the gaggle of geese, anyone can unleash a gaggle of geese and come up with a novel. But Queneau thought, and I really think, and I've always wondered what you think about this, but to me, I see the foundations of the Oulipo in this coming out of surrealism, even where after Queneau disagrees with Breton and leaves the surrealists in 29, for him, first he spends a few years investigating madness in literature, but then he really gets into this idea of structure. And for him, a novel needs to be like a poem. He loved the fact that poetry was constrained and that it made you work around issues that language or ideas would present to you. You had to do it in a certain way according to a certain number of rules. And so in a way, the classical French poem is the original constrained text for Queneau, who then grafts that onto the novel and says, well, I'm going to build these very structured novels, and they're going to have internal rhymes, whether those are scenes or places or people, and I'm going to build them like a poem. And it's much like Desnos's reaction to Breton as well, saying, well, we can be surreal and enjoy surrealism with structure. We don't need to be completely lost in the unconscious and just let things go where they will. We can organize it and still tap into the subconscious. So Queneau starts playing with this. And the difference we see, Chad, you mentioned the two different kinds of Oulipian novels or books. For Jacques Roubaud often spoke of the pudeur de la contrainte, how do you usually translate that, Daniel?
Let's say modesty more than half the time.
Modesty. Yeah, I mean, some of them, like Jacques Jouet, for instance, would, if he could, probably explain the constraint on the back of the book itself so that you were aware going in that it was there.
Yep.
And Queneau spoke instead of pulling away the scaffolding. So he called it échafaudage, and he would build a structure up like he was building a church or whatever, and then when he was done, all that scaffolding would come down. And I'm sure with Pierrot that there is probably what they refer to as the parerga somewhere, showing how this character ends up there and this one ends up there. Some of these they've preserved his drafts and some they haven't. But they're very constructed, and just because we can't see the rhyme or reason to that construction later on doesn't mean it's not there.
Right. It is interesting. Like, I think for some like I don't know, average readers, if there's such a thing, or people who aren't familiar with the works, haven't read any of these books, there might be like a sort of like intimidation factor. They're experimental, they've got the structure, they're like strange or whatever, but they're also like incredibly human. And I take that away from your introduction as well, that there is like there's a joy and a sort of, these characters are real, they're fleshed out in various ways, even though this is within a sort of schema of sorts that you may or may not realize, or algorithms moving people around. They still like have like full-bodied character experiences, and that makes it really unique. It's very fun to read all of Queneau's books, Zazie being like a really clear example of that, which obviously is Zazie and the Metro, which is probably the most famous of the novels because of the movie version and it being in print continuously for a long time. I don't even know, but and has like the titular character being like a spunky, funny young girl. It has like a lot going for it, but there is like a system in that of like mistaken identities and switches, but like nevertheless, like it reads in a lot of ways like a fun, interesting, semi-traditional novel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think when I was saying earlier about Queneau not making these empty gestures, I think the human is a really nice way to put that. Like, I don't think that's true of just Queneau. I think there are a lot of Oulipians for whom that's kind of what sets apart their work from the sort of joyless, soulless acrobatics that constrained literature is often written off as being. Yeah. But it's that these are people, Queneau in particular, and Perec too, and I could give a number of examples, but people who are really gifted at sort of working with both the scaffolding, whether or not it's important to them to keep it or to remove it once the reader is about to see it, but also infuse it with like a real lived-in humanity and personality. I think that is really vital with Queneau. Although the first thing I thought when you said that there's something intimidating about him is, for me, like, not so much in this notion of structure and this sort of everything is preordained, but just the way he uses language. Like, I still have not read all of Queneau. I'm kind of spotty on his earliest output. And there have been a lot of moments in my life where I've been like, especially, when I wasn't living in France, where I was like, my French is just not good enough to read a Queneau novel right now. Like, you got to just dive in and be prepared for things to not look like what they seem, and or to not be what they seem, not be what they look like. Just sort of like doggy paddle until you get swept up into the current, and then even then you're going to find things that are phrased strangely. The vocabulary is weird. There's no, again, like even at that micro sentence level, there's no identifiable logic as to why he will shift tense where he does, or go back into an 18th century register or whatever. Chris, I would love to hear.
Yeah, well, I don't think it needs to be intimidating. I think that's the first thing. And he makes it clear he thinks of his writing as the onion, right? Where there are all these layers, and if you want to read Zazie like a fun romp through the city with lots of pervy jokes and whatever, it's there. If you want to go down layer after layer, or just focus on one and ignore the others, there's always something there for you. So that's what makes translating him a real problem. Is, you know, I showed two people my translation before it went into NYRB, and both of them are very good with this sort of text, and one of them asked me, so who are you translating this for? Which is always a question we have to ask. And it's a difficult question to answer, but you know, the question for me is, why am I dealing with all of these little minute details that likely no one will ever notice? Because of all these layers, I need them to be there if someone wants to focus later on that particular layer. Like, for example, I'll let the cat out of the bag. I hope no one ever listens to this because I like the mystery of it. But in The Skin of Dreams, there's a reference to lice that keeps coming up over and over. And of course, if you want to get into Queneau's reading, then you find that, what's his name? Artemidorus Didaldi wrote the first manual on dream interpretation, and for him the dream was like an insect and a parasite, and everybody had one is the key. Everyone has dreams, and so every character in that book, either linguistically or verbally, has lice. Every single one. And so the last thing I had to do was build a table and make sure that everyone got their lice. Will anyone ever notice that? Probably not. But if someone wants to peel back to that particular layer and go exploring Queneau's kind of post-Freudian self-analysis period and wants to find all of the references to dreams in there, then they have to be present for me to be happy with how the book turned out. But as far as the reader goes, is that really a concern? Unless that's the particular layer that you're interested in, then no, there's the language layer, as Daniel points out, which is the most fun to translate and maybe the most fun to read. There's this alternation between registers, and this, in these two books in particular, in The Skin of Dreams, even more so than Pierrot, this exploration of tense and of kind of an early form of cinematic writing where the characters is constantly launched into a present as if you're watching a film and getting drawn into it. Things that seem a little strange in English, maybe. But yeah, so I think that's really the key, is not to be intimidated, but to just go in, enjoy the kooky story at the top, and explore any of the angles that interest you as you go, because he was a man with a great number of interests, and he did explore them all in these novels. I mean, some more than others. In fact, everything he would ever really work on is present from his first novel on. So I would think if you can read closely through Witchgrass and also through his last great novel, the 1960s one.
Flight of Icarus, right?
No, previous to that.
Blue
Flowers, yeah. Everything he really, that's to me the culmination, but
Flight of Icarus is too.
It's great. It's great. Yeah, I guess all I'm trying to say is there's no reason to be intimidated. It's really more a question of just following your own interests and allowing him to. And I go back and reread it a second time and find a totally different track to follow and find a different layer and enjoy that one. So that is the fun, especially when you get to read different translations of it too, because of course translators are having to focus on different things and having to choose one thing and exclude another to pull it off. So kind of highlights some of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is kudos to Barbara Wright, who did so many great books and like really did bring a lot of these authors to, even though some of them were retranslations, there were a lot of people and a lot of texts that she really brought to the forefront for English readers throughout her career, which is quite remarkable and quite interesting and wonderful, fun woman, fun translator. Speaking of fun, speaking of women, Sally Mara. So where does this book come from? You guys are the historians of sorts. There's the Queneau that we've been talking about, and then there is the two Sally Mara books, which can sort of be sectioned off. They're published under pseudonyms in 50 and 52 question mark. 50, oh no,
47 and 50.
Yeah, 47 and 50. What the fuck? What is all that?
I can do the basic history. So
I'm gonna let you field this one, Chris.
Mid-40s, again, Queneau is chumming around with Boris Vian, who's just about to publish for Gallimard for the first time. And Boris has this friend called Jean Dallois, who's running a new publishing house called Édition du Scorpion. And Boris says, yeah, we can make a few bucks. He'll publish whatever we give him. And he basically challenged Boris Vian to write him a novel that hit hard like Henry Miller. And Queneau was friends with Miller in this period as well. Miller had just left France, just outside of the war. So Vian writes his first Vernon Sullivan novel in 47, I think in 3 weeks he churns it out, and that book would cause him no ends of trouble because he'd end up embroiled in a big censorship trial in 1950 over that. It was a novel that was purportedly translated from the American English, and it's a racialized, very violent crime novel. Queneau, he says, sure, I'll do one too. And he churns out, churning for Queneau being more like 3 months instead of 3 weeks. He churns out this first Sally Mara book, On est toujours trop bon avec les femmes, or we always treat women too well, I think is the translation. And it's a remarkable book, and I spent far too much time analyzing it, mostly thanks to a couple of books done in the late 50s by a Frenchman named Pierre David, who went through it and found that Queneau had basically built this novel using fragments of Ulysses. So if the idea is it could rebuild Dublin if it were lost by the contents of Ulysses, I think Queneau's point is we could also rebuild Ulysses by the content of We Always Treat Women Too Well. So that is ostensibly translated by a made-up translator that he named after a popular songstress or popular movie star that he had a crush on. And it's a novel written by Sally Mara, which is the pseudonym he takes. And then 3 years later, the follow-up is supposed to be her diary from when she's actually learning French. She's an Irish gal, just come of age, as is evident in the novel. And so as far as the language games within it, I thought of translating this years ago, and I'm really glad that I let it go, because she's learning the language as the book goes on, and people are messing with her understanding of the language too, and it causes a lot of translation problems in my mind, in that one of the mistakes that people have made translating Queneau over the years is to just do what he does and not understand the why of it. So, for example, with his modified spellings, he's always doing something particular. He's playing with as Daniel pointed out, with the pronunciation of a word or the concatenation of words in the oral and bringing that into the written. And there's a reason behind it. If you just do that in English, it doesn't make any sense. There's no motivation for it. And the same problem I find with this acquisition plot is the mistakes that someone makes while learning French are not the mistakes someone makes while learning English. So it doesn't come straight across. And if you just replicate the same errors in the same places, there's a disconnect. Queneau is always logical, and there's almost always a reason. And the translation would be missing out on those reasons and missing out on making those subtext points. So anyways, that's the basic background of those two. I'm very curious to read Sally Morrow when it shows up later this week. I've got a pre-order on the way, and very curious because Chad informs me that the fellow that translated this not only wrote about it, which I've seen that he's done a work on the book, but that he spent many years trying to perfect it. So I'm very curious to see what he's come up with.
And yeah, and I think it's quite good, but like at the same time, like I'll bet you this could be retranslated or tweaked or added to or commented on or revised in a million ways for a million years. There are a lot of footnotes that James Gosling, as the translator, put in there. And part of his like belief in why he spent so much time and why he was like so dedicated to doing it is that he is Irish. So he had this kind of feel for that Irishness of play. Daniel, what do you think of these books? Are these ones that you you like?
I learned a lot from listening to Chris just now. I read On est toujours trop bon avec les femmes a couple of years ago without much context. Thought it was engrossing, but like maybe not that successful a novel. I think, hearing the sort of background of it being churned out in the mode that it was supposed to be in sort of puts it in a different frame for me. But it's so kind of lurid and violent and like
hold your hat, because
and again, it was never supposed to have his name on it is kind of the point. I think too that there was, for both of them, some fun in being able to write things that otherwise they wouldn't want to attach to their name. And so when Queneau, as a good friend, got up on the stand during Boris Vian's censorship trial and said, yeah, he was just having a lark, and I did it too, here's mine, we both did one at the same time. That's when it came out, and it was on record at that point that he had written the two of them. And it isn't until I think 62 that Gallimard finally republished both of them with a little blurb by him at the front fessing up to the fact that they were his. So I think if we can contextualize, if you're already 20 years into your literary career and you get to write something under a pseudonym, there's some liberation to it. And, it is ribald 1950 Paris. So I think, yeah, is there matter in both of these books that historically maybe is a little questionable? I would say yes, there is. But if we read them in the spirit in which they're written, and again, they're Queneau, there is some very fascinating stuff underneath, especially in the Joyce and Queneau collaboration there.
That I had no idea of until you just.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, and in fact, he's not used Joyce directly. That was my big question in the dissertation at first, was whether he was translating Joyce into it, but he was actually using the Stuart Gilbert and Morel translation.
And with Sally Morrow, there is like, it's a lot pervy, because basically her tutor that's been teaching her French is left, so she's decided to write a journal, her intimate journal about her life and about her feelings towards him. And throughout, she's innocent to a degree that's like caricature-esque, and every dude is trying to get with her, and in ways that are like very aggressively unacceptable in every way. And in every instance, she basically rebuffs them in ways that are both charming and pretty funny and like a little bit weird. But the reason that I really like this book, and I don't want to give it all away because I'm definitely going to run this on the website, but the very first page, she doesn't know how to use the word fuck. And so it leads throughout the whole book into like these like incredibly funny scenarios where I don't want to read the whole thing, but she's like, I'm going to write this diary in his mother tongue. These will be my French writings. And the others, my diaries in English. I'm going to fuck them into the fire. Fuck, he told me, is one of the most beautiful words in the French language. It means to throw, but with extra vigorosity. I repeat here his teachings, and what titillating pleasure it is to repeat them. A soft warmth filling my thoracic cavity from my shoulder blades to my young chest, which is not like a blade, i.e. flat. So, for example, you throw a glass of beer behind the necktie, but a diamond dazzles by fucking light into your eyes. I just can't. When I first got that read, I was just like, could not stop laughing. Because I'm like, as a fairly vulgar person who uses fuck a lot, like I think it's very, very fun. So there's a lot of like joy and like play with it and very weird. And it does have like these multi-layers of like the languages that are at use and like the like that she doesn't quite understand. Things are sort of off kilter. It makes it very fun, but it is like a Queneau novel that's not a Queneau novel in certain ways too. Like what you're saying, there's a gap. There's a distance.
Yeah, and he is playing with puns. He's really allowed to run with them in this one, and almost building like pun proverbs in a way, and that actually sets up the third Selimara book, which will one day be translated, and it will be short. But he did a third little addendum that he called foutaise, which I could only ever translate as fuckabouts, and it's just him taking basically like proverb forms and puns and like folding them in and on each other, and they're very tricky to play with, but it's a really interesting form, and one day someone will have to put those out as well, and that'll be the end of it.
That'd be fun.
I came across at the Harry Ransom Center, the archive in Austin, because they have some Queneau documents there. There's a piece of paper I found where he's basically copying out English swear words. He's just sort of like learning words for like boobs. And it's so sweet and wholesome. Like you're making me think of like, I think he writes bubs instead of boobs, and just like this really palpable incompleteness in his grasp of these words that he's learning. And I just love the idea of like seeing that spread out over a whole novel.
I think we need to start a rumor that Queneau was the first man ever to write boobs upside down on his calculator, because it probably happened.
Definitely.
Not only did he invent the choose your own adventure novel, he invented
upside down calculator writing.
58,008.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. So yeah, it is a really good time for to be introduced to Queneau or rediscovering Queneau through these two books, through Skin of Dreams forthcoming. Most of the others are all still available, I believe. The Dalkey ones, if they're not, they are in process. I think Odile is out of stock, but it's being reissued. Last Days is available, St. Glingland's available. And I thought the New Directions ones were still available, but I only have like used copies that I acquired over the years. And to be honest, I read all of them back in like the year 2000 or before I started at Dalkey. I got obsessed with this sort of writing through Harry Matthews and through Clarke and then Queneau, and read all of these books like one after another, and remember almost nothing of which one's which or like how they work. So it's kind of fun to like go back and reread them.
Yeah, there isn't that much more to come. I know someone is contemplating a retranslation of A Hard Winter, which has been out of print since the late 40s.
Right.
And Betty Asquith, I mean, it's a more straightforward novel, and she's very straightforward. I think from what I understand of her biography, the bulk of her writing was either novels or biography of like Victorian aristocrats. So you can kind of see it's the wrong style, the wrong demographic for other Queneau. It works okay with that, but it should be redone. I hear a rumor that someone's working on his book-length science poem as well.
Interesting.
Maybe several someones. And we'll see if that appears in the next few years.
Curious.
Yeah.
Wonder who that could be.
Yeah.
Chris, if I can just hijack the train for a second, Chad, if we have enough time, I just want to I'm really fascinated by retranslation in general, and I want to hear about what you what it was like to take The Skin of Dreams, and you kept the title from the initial English translation. But like, what was that sort of triangulation like between Queneau text, the initial translation, and like how closely did you read it to see what you wanted to take, what you wanted to not take? Like, just I don't have a very articulate question, but I would love to hear you speak for a couple minutes about that.
Yeah. Well, as far as the title goes, as Paul Fournel explains in his afterword, which is not in the galley that I sent you, it was Queneau's second choice. It was the working title for a good portion of the writing process. He had a list of 5 or 6 titles. And Sans Loin de Reuil, which is literally far from Reuil, which is a suburb in the western side of Paris. It doesn't mean anything to an English reader. It means even less to a Parisian now than it would have 50 years ago. Where it was, as Paul explains, it was separate. It was not, the suburbs were not necessarily attached. They were almost like another world. So NYRB decided to go with the same title just for common sense reasons, I think. As far as the process for it, to be honest, I didn't really look at the Kaplan at all during the translation. I read it, I think, about 10 years ago, and I first pitched it to a different publisher and did a sample then.
So you read it and sort of noted that it was due for a retranslation.
Yeah, it's clear to me. I mean, a few things. You mentioned this alternation between registers in your introduction to the Pierrot, and this is the novel after Pierrot, and it's even more evident he really starts to play with this these tiers of speech in the same sentence or with the same character even. And the fellow who translated it kind of washed most of that out. He was translating this story, which is maybe more common in 1948. And again, if you're trying to build in these layers and have all of these opportunities for different readings, then you can't wash out all of these details. But the linguistic playfulness is really the crucial one, and it's a very playful book on a lot of levels. So I read the Kaplan about 10 years ago when I finally found a copy, because it's been out of print in the New Directions issue since it came out in 48. I think it was reprinted once by someone in the UK. One World Classics or somebody did it. But that's out of print as well. Anyway, I didn't want him interfering with my reading of it. So when Edwin Frank finally got the rights for it and asked me to start on it, it was 5 years later. And so it was well out of my head. I just knew that it wasn't all there. And so I started from scratch. And I did go back with delight once I was done, once I had finished the translation, which took me almost 9 months, and go back and reread the Kaplan. And, I felt kind of vindicated in a number of spots where he just missed something completely or smoothed things out to the point where you couldn't really see what was supposed to be there, in my mind.
Yeah.
I can see that related to your earlier point too, of like being able to see like where things ended up in terms of like the Oulipo and Oulipian kind of constructs, and the Oulipo always plays with that idea of things that were Oulipian before they existed, before the Oulipo existed, and sort of bringing them in. But to be able to
plagiarism by anticipation.
There we go. Plagiarism by anticipation. The anticipation is perfect. And so it would be interesting to go back to those and be able to see it through that sort of the lens of what you know now, which would make a huge difference in translation and in retranslation compared to someone who's just handed a text in 1948 and is like, go do this, bang it out.
Make sure everyone has lice.
In fact, I'm lucky that I had done most of this research and dissertation before I really got in there too, because just understanding his motivation, and obviously you can never really know for sure what a writer intended when he wrote something, but if you get to know him and his interests, and I've read a lot of the linguistics books that he read and all of the essays that he wrote on language and that sort of thing from the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, it just makes it a lot easier to maybe understand the why and to try to replicate it in a way that that doesn't lose any of the motivation, as opposed to just, again, making the same mistakes in the same places, or using a funny spelling where he uses a funny spelling. It's actually a little tricky in English, I found, to find good motivated spots for playing with the spelling of words, but I think you'll find some of the ones that I chose were pretty clever.
Interesting.
We'll see.
Interesting. We should probably get wrapping this up, but is there anything that the two of you are working on, or that you'd like to plug, or any particular Queneau book or post Queneau book, anything you want to just send out a shout out for? Dead air.
No, I think we've sort of covered the basics of his fiction. His poetry and essays alone shouldn't be neglected. Like, he did a lot of really interesting stuff. His poetry his early poetry in particular is arguably even more sort of impressive for the way that it takes French as it was spoken by actual people and rolled it into something strange but compelling. That was both poetry and a sort of argument about language, like a kind of socio-political stance taking. And Chris, you were talking about the linguistics book, made me want to plug, if you can find it somewhere I'm not even sure it's on YouTube, but there's like a video of Queneau sort of giving a arithmetic demonstration.
Oh,
Chris,
wow.
you must know what I'm talking about. Like,
yeah, he does turn up in a few movies too. Again with Boris Vian, but Boris and Pierrot tried to convince Queneau for a long time that getting into the movies was the way to make money, because Queneau was always strapped for cash until Zazie came out. So they did make a few short films, and Queneau appears in a variety of them. One in Saint-Germain-des-Prés with all of the other literary celebrities of the day lurking around in the background and that sort of thing. Very interesting period. Lots going on in France at the time. As far as what I'd recommend right now, I'd recommend reading Pierrot just before you read The Skin of Dreams. I think it's interesting to see what he's focusing on, and how he develops them from one to the next to the next. You'll start to see in Pierrot a little bit of this tense switch, and we'll really get into this kind of cinematic present to past in the Skin of Dreams, which I have to admit was a real nuisance to translate, because he relies heavily on the French verb dire, which is the same in the past as it is in the present. And so he'll just repeat, he said, he said, he said, he said, but there will be a switch to the present in the middle of that, and I have to decide when it comes in English, whereas he got to hide behind the fact that those two words were the same in French. So it was a very interpretive process. I think they feed nicely one into the next, though. I think it's a great period for his books. They're very playful. A little dark, hints of darkness with the playfulness, considering it's the early 40s and what all is going on. But I would say, I would encourage anyone who hasn't read Barbara Wright's translation of Pierrot to do so.
Yeah, she was excellent. And get The Birthday Party by Laurent.
Naturally, by He Who Shall Not Be Named.
By He Who Shall Not Be Named. Great book, though. Very fun. Sort of fits into the too. So thank you both.
I'm impressed that you were able to slow down like almost everyone who I talked to about it was like, I wanted to read it slower, but like 100 pages from the end, I just like couldn't not read it because I needed to know how it ended.
No, that did happen. It's just like the only thing that ever constrained me was like obligations of other deadlines. So it's like, so I'm reading like for fun at night, and I'm like, oh, I would love to like just be able to read all night and stay up till 4 a.m. finishing a book, but I am old as shit. And that is like so much not possible anymore. Like it was 20, 30 years ago. So it's more that, but it is propulsive. It's really engaging, and like the style and the sort of like way that it kind of swoops and like goes from character to character is very cinematic in a way too, because you sort of pop in and out and see things and get pieces of the past, and the kind of flow and rhythm of it is beautiful. Can't imagine.
Yeah, it's a very cool, very successful experiment of a book, I think.
Absolutely. Totally agree. And with that, thank you both for doing this. It's been very fun to talk to both of you. Love Queneau. It's great to like learn from two real experts. And if you're listening, rate us, review us, follow us. You can tell your friends, all that kind of fun stuff. And we'll be back at some point with some more episodes.
Ma cocotte, elle est partie avec un vilain bonhomme. Je suis seul toute la nuit. Pas possible faire un somme. À la pêche des cœurs, je ne veux plus aller. Je ne veux plus ma mère. Y en a fini bonheur quand l'amour s'envolait et laissait larmes amères. Au bistrot d'oncle Fernand, c'est le calypso qui commence. Je vais passer un instant, mais je resterai sur mon banc.